Prime Minister Andrew Holness has floated the idea of Jamaica establishing its own final court of appeal. This amid the raging debate over whether the country should turn away from the Judicial Committee of the UK-based Privy Council and replace it with the Caribbean Court of Justice, the CCJ. But questions emerge. What's best for the Jamaican people? And what mechanism is best for the Jamaican people to use to instruct their politicians about what to do when they sit in Parliament to decide? That's the issue today on Lead Story on CVM TV. Welcome to Lead Story here on CVM TV. Before I introduce my guests, the issue of constitutional reform has dominated the agenda following the news that the Constitutional Reform Committee had prepared a report, submitted it to Cabinet. The news was that it was to have been tabled in the House of Representatives this afternoon. Of course, at that point, that ministry paper would become a public document so Jamaicans could see just what their leaders have in store for them where the issue of constitutional reform is concerned. Now, the matter of Jamaica's final appellate court, of course, we have one already, but the matter of what the status of that should be going forward is not being dealt with in this first phase of constitutional reform. That has been scheduled to come in phase 2, something which rankles with the opposition PNP and their own agenda. They want to see that issue be dealt with up front, and because it is not being dealt with up front in phase 1, that has triggered an impasse with the government, and we are at this point still uncertain if the process will proceed, notwithstanding the government's optimism that there can be an agreement reached, especially if both leaders Andrew Holness and Mark Golding sit and come to some agreement. A mouthful has been said, but this is a heavy lifting issue after all. What we're going to do with the show this evening is to set it up like this. We're going to hear from the Prime Minister comments he made when he was a guest on CVM at Sunrise on Monday, and then we'll play for you what the opposition leader Mark Golding said last Tuesday at a press conference he called to deal with the issue, to set some perspective and some context in the event you were in a box and you haven't been following what has been happening where the issue of Jamaica's final appellate court is concerned. So first up is the Prime Minister talking about dangling the possibility of Jamaica establishing its own final court of appeal.
Our position is that a final court should be a Jamaican final court. However, whatever ends up being the final court should go through this process of an indicative referendum. The people should have a say on it. That's number one for us. People should have a say. And secondly, if we are having a final court to be repatriated, it shouldn't go to Port of Spain, it should come to Kingston. That has been our position. Now, on the matter of the final court, because we are saying to the people of Jamaica, we also want to hear your view on it. It may very well turn out that the view of the public is that it should be the CCJ.
Right.
So what we don't want to do is to go to the situation in prescribing to the people of Jamaica.
So you
have
a position, but it's not a hardline position.
No, our position is, first and foremost, let the people decide it. Right? What we would like to see is this, but really, the people should decide it. What the PNP is saying is, don't ask the people anything. Just go to the CCJ.
Prime Minister saying that the dog should wag the tail shouldn't wag the dog. The people should tell the leaders what to do. Well, let's get the perspective from the opposition leader, Mark Golding, who has been on the record saying this matter doesn't need a referendum because the Constitution is clear as to the steps to take to get rid of the Privy Council.
Our position is that time come to leave the British monarchy in full, once and for all. When Jamaica is moving out of the King's Yard, we cannot have 1 foot in and 1 foot out of the yard. That would leave us neither fish nor fowl in another man's yard. That can't work. We will not support a phased approach to dealing with the matter of full decolonization, because the phased approach does not guarantee its attainment. It may never happen. if we do it that way. The arrangements for access to our people's final court need to get away from visa requirements. We need to get away from rules of court that are in conflict with and whittle down our constitutional rights of appeal. We need to get away from the exorbitant costs of appealing to a final court in London. Ladies and gentlemen, an appeal to the final court can cost taxpayers of Jamaica, in a case involving the government, of over $130 million for one appeal. That is unsustainable and a waste of taxpayers' resources, given where we are in terms of our institutional arrangements regionally.
Opinions that are effectively dueling dragons, the Prime Minister's position not marrying with what the opposition leader believes the process should be and what the end result ought to be. I'm going to introduce my guests right now. Senior Lecturer, Institute of Gender and Development Studies at the UWI, Dr. Maziki Thame, and the Chairman of Jamaicans for Justice. He's also an attorney at law, John Clark. Welcome.
Thank you for having us.
Good. Glad you made it, Dr. Thame. We were worried for a minute. We don't have much time left in this first segment, so just initial comments from you about the way this issue is poised at the moment, the battle over what the final court ought to be and the positions expressed by both leaders.
So remember that there is a process before this one.
Yes.
And the CCJ was agreed to in 1995. And I think that is where the PNP is leading from in terms of how it sees the process going forward just now. The introduction of the idea, and we know that deciding on the CCJ legally requires a 2/3 majority in the House, right? The idea that the people should participate in a decision around the CCJ, I don't necessarily object to that. But we have to think about it in longer political context as well, in relation to the referendum of 1961, in which the Bustamante administration was using the referendum as a way to get people involved, but specifically to get them involved because he understood that the Jamaican people were not necessarily sufficiently politically savvy, aware, and able to make a decision at that level. And he reasoned that they would choose not to go with the Caribbean in the Federation. Yes. And I think that that is the kind of thinking that is informing Andrew Holness in this moment, because his political identity is tied to the Bustamante, Edward Seaga eras, the idea that Jamaica is with the West, that Caribbean integration is not necessarily favorable, that a kind of narrow understanding of independence that, frees Jamaica from the rest of the Caribbean is at play in that case, whereas traditionally the PNP has been for regional integration.
All right, we've gotten the opening salvo from Dr. Thame. We'll get John Clark's initial response after the break, and then we'll take the conversation further. This is Lead Story.
All on the place feel cold. Hey. Check that place in mold. Weird spots on wall and the place smell bold. Hey. Check that place in mold. It affects the young, it affects the old. Hey. Check that place in mold. Call hygiene Lee and make we roll. Hey. Check that place in mold. Get your mold inspection done today.
Call us today to inquire at 876-630-2572. Hygiene Lee. It's simple. We clean to the core.
World family, you hear the news? T20 cricketer come back a Sabina. So me want to come back to Sabina. From South Africa team I come to contest with T20 squad. So me want to give them on support by coming back to Sabina. Enough prizes and surprises. So please come back to Sabina.
Watch all 3 matches live on CVM TV.
3 rows before Jamaica is what we are being told. One, a final court of appeal being built here at the cost of hundreds of millions of dollars. Two, remain with the UK-based Privy Council. I almost said remain with the evil, you know, depending on certain people, but nobody can question the judgments of the Privy Council. I haven't heard that in the mix. And three, whether or not it's not time, long overdue even, to subscribe fully to the Caribbean Court of Justice and go beyond interpreting matters under the Treaty of Travel-Ramos, which we currently are signatories to where the CCJ is concerned. I have Dr. Baziki Thame with me, and I have John Clark. John, I come to you because I want to get from you a sense of the positions taken by both leaders. Holness now putting this one in the mix about a final court owned, built by Jamaica as an alternative to the Privy Council. If we go there, Golding saying CCJ or nothing. How do these positions reconcile with what the country seemingly wants to achieve as part of constitutional reform?
Well, when I listened to the Prime Minister, what I heard from him is that Jamaica should have a final appellate court, a Jamaican final court. And that is his solution, but he wants the people to decide. Now, the Privy Council, in one sense, is Jamaica's current final appellate court. And if the CCJ is the choice, it will also be Jamaica's final appellate court. But the important purpose for an appellate court is for the citizens to be able to bring grievances in relation to Court of Appeal judgments, to have them adjudicated by superior judges. Superior not necessarily because they're infallible, but superior in terms of jurisdiction and what is of concern to me, and of grave concern, especially because at JFG we would receive numerous letters from prisoners who are in prison and who say, yes, we have a serious concern with how our judgment was dealt with by the Court of Appeal. How do we afford the $30 million that we need to do just to get justice at the Privy Council? And for many of these Jamaicans, the access door of justice is closed, slamming their face simply on the financial criteria. And one would hope that our leaders, when they're making this decision, would appreciate that there are Jamaicans right now as we speak tonight who are in prison, who say they want a final appellate court to decide their issue, but they just don't have the bread, they don't have the butter to access the final appellate court. So whilst we diddle and daddle, we must never forget that there are people whose very liberty, and in some cases life, because you have Jamaicans who have died in custody, awaiting justice, whose very life depends on this answer. Now, if they can't afford to go to the final appellate court, what use is it to them?
Yes.
And that is the ultimate question. And then when we hear this discussion about a Jamaican final appellate court housed in Jamaica, then one wonders about the criticism that was leveled against the CCJ, that the Caribbean is so small that we all know each other. So if the Caribbean is so small, isn't Jamaica smaller than the Caribbean?
Yes, absolutely. But hold it right there, because Dr. Thame, here's the thing. The issue of how to decide what to do, whether to keep what we have, take on something new, whether that be the CCJ or something else. The PNP say no to a referendum. Holness, warm to a referendum. He thinks that's the obvious place to go to get an indicative instruction from the people. Where do you stand?
So I just want to respond to John Clark first, in that the idea that money plays a role in the court system. You know,
and in the pursuit of justice.
Exactly. Once you are able to hire a better quality lawyer, you are already protected under the law. So there's always this inequality there, and we should always remember that. In relation to the question of referendum, I think that what we have heard from the Prime Minister is not just in relation to the CCJ, but there is a tying of a number of issues, not just whether we are leaving the monarchy, but also the final court. It includes issues like the Buggery law, etc. And there may be, some political calculations about the direction it would go in if we tie a set of issues together. I'm not sure how it is that, they imagine that playing out. But the question of people's inclusion in political decision-making is, of course, at hand. I think that's where you have an interest. Referendums are one measure, right? And I think that in Jamaica, we should be thinking more critically, and I had hoped that this constitutional reform discussion would go in this direction about how to realize participatory democracy, how to involve people in more decisions that the state is, taking, and especially decisions about the economy, because there is a way that we think that there are spaces that so-called experts alone can, participate in when, as it relates to legislature, the economy, etc. It's everyday people that are experiencing the results of decisions.
But don't everyday people, on that point, John Clark, don't everyday people need to be guided as to what their choices are? Because if you look at the members, the constituent parts of the Constitutional Reform Committee, you have the most eminent constitutional lawyer in the country's history, Dr. Lloyd Barnett, still going strong at 92 years old. We have the Minister of Legal and Constitutional Affairs. She's a former member of the bench. She's been at all levels in the judiciary. You have youth leaders. You have members representing faith-based communities. You have people with the intellectual gravitas that you would trust to be able to guide. Isn't that a significant part of any arrangement? So you hear from the people in consultations, you allow the experts to do their thing, then you move it on to the parliament and ask the parliamentarians to represent what their constituents want. Isn't this the right way to go about a process like this?
I see nothing wrong with going about the process in that way, but the question that asked Dr. Thiem was about as it relates to the referendum. And if we have the people's representative in Parliament and the people's representative agreed, I believe was it in 1994-95, that this is a direction one day will hope to go with the CCJ.
Yes.
But then now in 2024 we're hearing a kind of a change in position, and one wonders what caused that change. Bearing in mind that the first time when we had the Privy Council as a young nation, the people of Jamaica, that is the grassroots people, did not have a vote to say we wanted the Privy Council.
But Dr. They spoke of them also not being politically savvy enough, which is true at that time.
But even...
No, that's not what I meant specifically on the question of federation and the particular manipulation that would have gone into them siding with the idea that we should be suspicious of our Caribbean neighbors.
Yes. Finish the point now, John.
Yes, I'm saying that the point that the people's representative cannot make a determination and cannot, on behalf of the people who in fact elected them to be the people's representative and who in fact caused them many different days to sit down in Parliament and vote for laws for them to change a position which was never our own position, but which was imported into our own framework. That the Privy Council is our final appellate court. Why can't the people's representative change that? But ultimately, the Prime Minister said, and he had said it before on the political stage, that this issue should be decided by a referendum. And one would have hoped that the referendum, even if that's a choice, that the both political parties will not have this issue of the final court dancing around.
I have to take the break. We can finish it up after these. This is Lead Story talking constitutional reform, what to do where the matter of our final court of appeal is concerned.
Made from Lesham Cosmetics, Jamaica's only vegan organic makeup brand. We are the exclusive makeup sponsors for this year's MSW events 14-14-14 Mask Wedding. Our talented team of makeup artists will be providing complimentary bridal makeup services for all brides, and we're so excited. So, if you have a wedding coming up, you can find us at leshamcosmetics.com or on Instagram at leshamcosmetics.
Don't miss it. New Budget Supplies pre-Labor Day massive yard sale. 5 crazy days.
New Budget gone crazy.
May 17 to 22.
Yes, boy.
Clearance on old or damaged stock up to 50% off. Including lumber, doors, toilets, drywalls, PVC pipes, and clearance on broken tiles.
I want some of that.
We've got specials on paints, film face ply, zinc, and so much more.
I want that too.
You can't afford to miss this crazy yard sale.
That New Budget, do it again.
In 2015, the then PNP administration passed 3 bills in Parliament, took 3 bills to Parliament, hoping to get the CCJ installed as Jamaica's final court of appeal. The opposition JLP then did not support the move. The effort died in the upper house of Parliament, the Senate. And here we are facing a stalemate once again where Mark Golding has said, well, look, if you guys are not talking about CCJ right up front, then it's unlikely that I will support this constitutional reform process going forward. And his two nominees, well, two of the three nominees to the Constitutional Reform Committee, the three of them, King's Counsel Hugh Small, Anthony Hilton, the West St. Andrew MP, and Senator Donna Scott Motley. Scott Motley and Hilton have been instructed by Golding not to support going forward if it is that the CCJ is not put up front and that the Prime Minister does not declare his own position on the CCJ, which is something that Mark Golding has consistently asked Andrew Holness to declare. So just some context for the discussion. So here we are. We have this process in front of us. We have Jamaicans listening and wondering, okay, what is it that we are required to do and how are we required to do it? I'm going to ask you straight up, do you think that we should just go the referendum route and then take that result to the Parliament and our legislators abide by the result of the referendum? Is it as simple as that?
The referendum route on what though?
On the CCJ and the final court of appeal.
Well, I think we already agreed to the CCJ in 1995. So I think...
But we didn't agree on it in 2015. When it went to Parliament,
the process.
The opposition, JLP, then didn't support it.
The process.
Well, the question for me is what... Okay, we benefit from a Caribbean Court of Justice in terms of Caribbean jurisprudence more generally. We've invested in the University of the West Indies. We've trained our own. We have, scholarship to draw from in terms of representing the interests of the Caribbean people. And to bring in at this time the idea that, we should go with a Jamaican final court, I think is a backward move. I think that the CCJ is appropriate and we have agreed on it in the past. There was some consensus and that we can move on that consensus, particularly because it shows confidence in the idea that as a Caribbean region, we recognize, a joint history and essentially a joint future. I don't think that in the 21st century we should be thinking of Jamaica as a small island state, as, outside the frame of cooperation in the Caribbean.
Yeah. John, if we go the route of a referendum on the CCJ, and of course, a referendum or referenda in the past, they're not loaded. It's a straightforward question so as not to confuse the public. If we go the route of a referendum, should both parties meet and agree not to politicize the campaign around it, so that we get a purer delivery of what the people want, rather than people simply voting because I'm a PNP or a Labourite, I vote this way?
Well, one would hope that is the ideal, that is both political parties would agree either that we will be supporting the CCJ and that the issue will not become a green or orange issue. But as one can see, even in the UK own referendum, Brexit referendum, the political leaders were allowed to leave the ban of the political parties and stick to a position that was more a conscience position. So you have some persons in either party supporting stay, and some persons in either party supporting go. But ultimately, the question I have for anybody who is wavering about the CCJ against the Privy Council, we must never forget that the Privy Council at its core make recommendations to the King in relation to what decision should be made. Because final appellate decision is normally a decision for the King.
Yes.
If we're saying that we want to keep ourselves fully a republic, to whom would that recommendation be made? One, and ideally, what it is about the British system that is more so superior to the Caribbean system, where we would say we would go away with a CCJ that we, the Jamaican people, help to pay and help to fund.
And do you agree with Dr. Thame that this idea of a Jamaican final court is a backwards step, is almost a non-starter?
I believe it's a non-starter on the basis that we have already invested so much money and time in the CCJ. So if we're going to start a final Jamaica appellate court, that would mean more decades of work and funding. And ultimately we find it so hard to even fund our parish courts. how are we going to find the money to fund a brand new appellate court?
Yeah, Dr. Thame, partisanship and partisan politics is a sport by itself in Jamaica. People are deeply orange and deeply green.
Deeply partisan and sometimes unable to see, a collective good.
Yeah.
We can't sometimes even reason beyond the party frame.
So with that understanding, do you see any referendum process being hostage to the kind of partisan consideration that is not likely to yield the best results for the parliamentarians to act on when they go to the House of
It will
Representatives?
definitely play out. There is no question. It will play out in that kind of way. You said something earlier about, a kind of guiding process.
Yes.
Education, political education is very important,
Yes.
not just at this moment, but in general. We want a public that is aware, that is, literate in matters of public interest, and that is able to make, best interest, collective good decision, rather than one that is just partisan. And certainly with, low levels of education in Jamaica, people are more easily manipulated.
Yeah, well I'll say to the viewers as we close that the Brexit referendum taught me many things about how referenda can play out. 47% voted stay, 53% voted leave. But in the cut and thrust or arguing over what the people actually voted for, you were lost as to, what it is that Britain really wanted, because people voted leave and wanted to change their mind, people voted stay and wanted to change their mind as things came out in the wash beyond the promises of the politicians about what each position meant. And that's the danger in a referendum. It will be politicized. As night follows day, that will happen to it. And when that happens, what kind of indicative result will it deliver? What will our politicians go to Parliament to do? And don't forget, those 21 senators who were elected by nobody, but were nominated by the Prime Minister, were nominated by the opposition leader, whose bidding do they carry out when they go to Parliament? Each of the 63 MPs is tied to a constituency. I can stand and say that my MP in Eastern St. Andrew ought to vote this way because that's what I voted for. If you slice up what Eastern St. Andrew voted for in the referendum, they have to go and represent that. But what do you say about Senator X or Senator Y? How do they vote? Do they vote their conscience? Who seeds this conscience? It's a lot of things to think about as we embark on this process. But I certainly believe that I'm a Privy Council man, I must declare.